Her voice cracked in the heat, thin as a dry reed, and it carried farther than she meant it to. Those 4 words would change everything. Not just for her, but for a whole town that had forgotten what decency looked like. Before we go any further, I want you to know something. This story is about a woman who refused to break. It is about a man who chose to see the truth when everyone else looked away. And it is about a town that had to decide what kind of place it wanted to be. If you have ever felt invisible, if you have ever been blamed for something you did not do, if you have ever wondered whether anyone would stand up for you when it mattered most, then this story is for you. So pour yourself a cup of tea, settle in, and tell me in the comments what time it is where you are and where you're listening from, because Lily Mercer's story deserves to be heard, and maybe, just maybe, it will remind you of your own strength. Now let me take you back to that day. The day everything changed. Lily Mercer tried to swallow, but her throat had turned to dust. The Kansas sun stood straight overhead, white and merciless, pressing down on the grass until the land itself seemed to hold its breath. She lay stretched on the hard ground near the river flats, wrists bound tight, ankles pulled apart. Her dress torn and covered with straw and dirt. Every muscle in her body trembled, not just from the pain of the ropes cutting into her skin, but from the shame that burned deeper than any wound. She tried to turn her head away, but there was nowhere to look that did not remind her she was being watched. A circle of women stood back from her, far enough to keep their skirts clean, close enough to make sure she knew she was not alone in her suffering. Their faces were tight, lips thin, eyes hard as stone. Like this punishment had been decided long before Lily ever spoke her first word in town. She did not know most of their names. She had only been in Dodge City for a week, 7 days. That was all it took for her life to fall apart. The sun beat down without mercy. Sweat ran into her eyes, mixing with tears she refused to let fall. She would not give them that satisfaction. She would not beg. Begging had already been taken from her. One of the women shifted her weight. Boots scuffed against dry grass. Another crossed her arms and muttered something about decency and lessons that needed to be taught. Lily heard the words but did not respond. What was the point? They had already made up their minds. The heat crawled over her skin, slow and heavy. Every minute felt longer than the last. She thought of her mother back east, of cool water and clean sheets, of a life that now seemed like it belonged to someone else entirely. She had come west for work and a clean start. She had come west to escape the whispers and the judgment of a small town that had already decided who she was supposed to be. And now look at her, tied out on the edge of Dodge City land, treated like a warning sign nailed into the dirt. That spot. It hurts. The words slipped out again before she could stop them. The pain in her wrists had become a fire that spread up her arms. But worse than the physical pain was the knowing that no one was coming. The knowing that this was meant to teach her something, to grind her down until she learned her place, or left, or did not get back up at all. Then she heard the horse. At first it was only a rhythm, distant and uneven, hooves striking dry ground. One of the women glanced toward the sound, her jaw tightening. Another hissed for quiet, but the horse came closer anyway. Dust lifted on the breeze and a shadow stretched across the field, long and unmistakable. A man reined in a few steps away. He did not speak right off, he just looked. Caleb Hart swung down from the saddle, slow and careful, like a man walking into a room where every word mattered. He was broad-shouldered and sun-worn, with gray in his beard and eyes that had seen too many summers like this one. His gaze went first to the ropes, then to Lily's face, then to the women standing back, pretending this was none of their business. He knelt beside Lily, close enough for her to smell leather and dust, close enough to feel a flicker of shade cross her burning skin. She opened her eyes and met his. There was no pity in them. There was something heavier, something like anger held on a tight rein. She tried to shift, and the pain flared hot and sudden, stealing her breath. Her voice came out rough, almost broken. "That spot. It hurts." Caleb followed her eyes with his own, quiet and steady, like a man trying not to jump to the worst thought in his mind. Then he reached for his belt. The women stirred. One of them stepped forward, her voice sharp as broken glass. "Stay out of this. This is women's business." Caleb did not look up. He drew his knife. The steel flashed once in the sun. A breath passed. Then another. The rope gave way under his hand. It snapped loose, rough fibers falling apart like they had been waiting for someone to set them free. Lily gasped as the tension released. Pain washed through her in a rush that made her shake from head to toe. Before anyone could stop him, Caleb shrugged out of his coat and laid it over her, firm and careful, like it was the most natural thing in the world. He lifted her then, not gentle, not rough, certain. The women started shouting, voices colliding like thunder, calling him a fool, a traitor, a man who did not understand what kind of girl this was. In the commotion, Lily saw something flutter to the ground, a white handkerchief slipping from someone's sleeve. It landed in the dust near Caleb's boot. He did not say a word about it. He just looked at it long enough to see the letter stitched in the corner, a single letter, V. He remembered it. Caleb turned with Lily cradled against his chest, and for the first time, he spoke. His voice was low and steady, and it carried across that field like a verdict. "This is done, all of it." He mounted his horse with her in his arms. But instead of turning away from town, instead of riding for the open range where no one would see, Caleb kicked his heels and aimed straight for the road that led back to Dodge City. That was the moment everything changed. People came out of doorways. Hands froze halfway through work. Conversations died mid-sentence as they saw who he carried and where he was headed. Caleb reined in near the church, right where no one could look away. He dismounted, set Lily down in the shade of the steeple, and stood over her, silent, unyielding. Dust settled around them. No one spoke. The whole street went still, like Dodge City had forgotten how to breathe. What was meant to be hidden had been dragged into the open. And now, everyone had to decide what they were going to do about it. The first person to move was a little boy with a slingshot tucked in his back pocket. He stopped mid-step, eyes wide, like he had just walked into a funeral he was not supposed to attend. A woman behind him grabbed his shoulder and pulled him back. Not gentle, not cruel, just scared of being seen caring too much. A man in a sweat-stained hat took off his hat out of respect. Then he put it back on when he realized nobody else had done the same. Caleb watched all of it, and he knew. That was how a town decided its soul, one small choice at a time. Across the street, the door to a dress shop creaked open. But no one came out. A shadow sat in that doorway like a judge who never had to show her face. The sheriff cleared his throat. Loud, like noise could erase what people had already seen. Caleb turned his head just enough to catch the sheriff's eyes. The man looked away fast, and that told Caleb everything he needed to know. There was a chain somewhere, and it did not start with Lily. Lily lay under Caleb's coat, breathing shallow, eyes open and staring at the church steps. She was trying to memorize every face, every person who stayed silent, every person who looked away. She would not forget. Even if she survived this, she would not forget who chose comfort over courage. Caleb leaned down, not close enough to crowd her, just close enough to be heard. "You did one thing right today. You came back into town." His voice was quiet but firm. That took more grit than most folks in Dodge City have in their whole body. Lily blinked once. A tiny sound left her throat. Not a word. More like a promise she was making to herself. Caleb stood again and faced the street. He felt the whole town waiting to see if he would flinch. He did not. A wagon appeared at the end of the road, kicking up dust as it rattled closer. Mrs. Nora Hale sat at the reins, her gray hair pulled back tight, her face set in that no-nonsense expression she wore like armor. She was the widow who lived near Fort Dodge, the one who knew more about tending wounds than most doctors west of the Mississippi. Caleb had sent a boy running to fetch her the moment he carried Lily into town. Mrs. Hale climbed down from the wagon with a basket in her arms and a look in her eyes that could cut through steel. She knelt beside Lily and checked her wrists first, then her ankles. Then she leaned close and murmured soft instructions that only Lily could hear. The sheriff shifted his weight again. He said maybe everyone should just head home. He said this had all gone far enough. Caleb finally spoke. It went far enough when a woman was tied out in the sun like an animal. His voice did not rise. It did not need to. If anyone here has something to say about this woman, they can say it to me. Right now. Face to face. No one did, not then. People drifted away one by one, the way folks always do when they hope a problem will solve itself if they just ignore it long enough. But one woman stayed. She stood in the doorway of her shop, expression calm, hands folded like she had just finished a particularly satisfying chore. Vivian Crow. She was maybe 45 years old, handsome in a sharp kind of way. The kind of woman who wore her respectability like a weapon. She owned the dress shop. She led the church choir. She organized the charity drives and decided who deserved help and who did not. Beside her stood another woman, younger, pale as flour, eyes fixed on the ground like she was terrified to look up. Martha Phelps, the wife of a man named Ezra. Lily caught Martha's eye from where she lay, just for a second. And in that second she saw something. Fear, guilt, and underneath it all, a desperate kind of hope. Like Martha wanted to speak, but did not know how to do it without getting crushed. Then Vivian's hand came down on Martha's shoulder, light as a feather, heavy as a stone. Martha's eyes dropped back to the ground. Mrs. Hale finished her examination and helped Lily onto the back of the wagon. She told Caleb that Lily needed rest, shade, and time. Time was the one thing Dodge City never wanted to give. Caleb walked beside the wagon as it rolled toward the edge of town. He did not look back at the people watching from their windows. He did not care what they thought. Not anymore. As they passed the last building, Lily reached out and grabbed his sleeve. Her grip was weak but certain. I did not do what they said. Her voice was raw, barely above a whisper. I saw something I was not supposed to see. Papers, seals, men meeting after dark. I think that is why this happened. Caleb nodded slowly. He believed her. Not because she was young, not because she was hurt, but because lies had a way of announcing themselves. They always smelled wrong. And this story rang clean. He told her to rest. He told her Mrs. Hale would take care of her. He told her he would be back. Then he turned his horse around and headed back toward town. The weight of old memories settled on his shoulders as he rode. He had seen this before. Different faces, different names, same rules. A group deciding who deserved protection and who did not. A woman made into a lesson so others would not ask questions. Power dressed up in Sunday clothes and called righteousness. He had watched it happen once, years ago. He had not spoken up then. He still carried that silence like a stone in his chest. Not this time. Back in Dodge City, the afternoon sun slid lower in the sky. Shadows stretched long across the main street. The saloon doors hung still. Men pretended to be busy, but their eyes followed Caleb as he tied his horse and walked inside. He did not want a drink, but the saloon was where truth usually leaked out first. Men got careless when whiskey loosened their tongues. The air inside smelled of dust and cheap liquor. A card game paused. Someone coughed. Nobody welcomed him. Caleb ordered water. Just water. That alone earned him a few looks. A ranch hand near the bar muttered something about decent women and the men who defended them. Caleb ignored it. He had learned a long time ago that answering every insult only made the noise louder. Instead, he listened. The talk circled the same way it always did. She brought it on herself. Vivian was only doing what had to be done. The town cannot afford that kind of trouble. Caleb turned on his stool and finally spoke. Calm. Even. Who exactly saw her do anything wrong? No one answered him straight. They glanced at each other, shrugged, took sips of their drinks. Everybody knows I heard from somebody. That is what they said. But nobody could name a single witness. Nobody could point to a single moment. Nobody had seen anything with their own eyes. That told Caleb everything he needed to know. A man bumped his shoulder on purpose as he walked past. Caleb did not move. The man tried again. This time Caleb stood. Chairs scraped back. Someone laughed too loud. It did not turn into a full fight. Not yet. But a shove landed. Then a punch followed, quick and sloppy. Caleb took the hit, stepped in close, put the man down with one solid swing. No flourish, no show. Just enough to remind the room he was not an easy target. The bartender barked for calm. The sheriff appeared in the doorway like he had been waiting for exactly this moment. "Cool it, Hart." Caleb straightened his coat. "I will be happy to, just as soon as this town stops tying women out in the sun." The sheriff's jaw tightened. It is not that simple. Caleb knew what that meant. Debt, pressure, fear of standing alone. The sheriff was caught in something bigger than his badge could handle. Later that evening, Caleb walked through town alone, past the dry goods store, past the boarding house where Lily had been staying, past Vivian Crow's dress shop, where the lights glowed warm and inviting. Vivian stood inside measuring cloth, smiling at a customer. Perfect, untouchable. Caleb kept walking. He found the boarding house manager nervous and fidgeting, but the man led him to Lily's narrow room anyway. It was not much. A bed, a wash basin, a small table near the window. But on that table sat something that did not belong. An envelope, empty now. But the edge was marked with a faint red stain, wax. A seal like that did not belong in a cheap boarding house. It belonged in offices where land changed hands and money disappeared. Caleb leaned closer. The mark was not random. It was pressed clean, deliberate. The same kind of seal he had seen years ago on papers that were not meant to hold up in daylight. As he straightened, a shadow fell across the doorway behind him. A man stood there. Not a local. His coat was too clean. His boots were worn in a way that spoke of miles traveled, not mud worked. The stranger asked if Lily had mentioned anything else. Caleb did not answer right away. He studied the man's face. There was no threat in it, just patience. The stranger said he was passing through, following some bad paper along the rail line. He said Dodge City kept coming up more often than it should. Caleb nodded once. That was all. But now he knew. Whatever Lily had stumbled into was bigger than one woman's reputation. It was bigger than one town's gossip. And somebody had decided she needed to be silenced before she figured out just how big it really was. The evening air cooled as Caleb rode out toward Mrs. Hale's place near Fort Dodge. The sky had turned orange and purple, streaked with clouds that looked like bruises healing slow. He let his horse pick the pace while his mind worked through everything he had learned. Mrs. Hale's cabin sat at the edge of the military road. Small but sturdy. The kind of place that had weathered more storms than it had any right to survive. A lamp burned in the window as Caleb approached. Mrs. Hale met him at the door before he could knock. She is awake. Stronger than she looks. But whatever happened out there took something from her that rest alone will not fix. Caleb removed his hat. "Can I speak with her?" Mrs. Hale studied his face for a long moment. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because she stepped aside and let him in. Lily sat propped up on a narrow bed in the corner. Her wrists were wrapped in clean bandages. Color had returned to her cheeks, though her eyes stayed sharp and watchful, like a deer that had learned the hard way that danger could come from anywhere. She looked up when Caleb entered. "You came back." It was not a question. More like she was testing the words to see if they were real. "I said I would." Caleb pulled a wooden chair closer and sat down. He did not crowd her. He did not rush. "I need you to tell me everything, from the beginning. Everything you saw, everything you heard. No detail is too small." Lily was quiet for a moment. Her fingers traced the edge of the blanket covering her lap. Then she started talking. I came to Dodge City 7 days ago. A week, that is all. I took the stage from back east. I had a little money saved, enough to get me started somewhere new. She paused. Her voice steadied. I grew up in a small town in Ohio, the kind of place where everybody knows your business before you do. My father died when I was young. My mother did what she could, but it was never enough. When she passed 2 years ago, I knew I had to leave. There was nothing cruel about the town itself, but there was nothing kind either. I was the girl without family, the girl who worked at the laundry, the girl nobody expected anything from. I wanted more. I wanted to be somewhere nobody knew my name, somewhere I could decide for myself who I was going to be. She met Caleb's eyes. Dodge City was supposed to be that place. The boarding house was cheap but clean. I took a room near the back. Narrow, one window, a bed that creaked every time I moved. But it was mine, and that mattered. I found work fast, washing dishes at the restaurant near the Santa Fe Trail. The pay was not much, but it was honest. I kept my head down, did my work, stayed out of trouble. Then I met Ezra. Lily's hands tightened on the blanket. He worked at the stables down the street. Friendly. Too friendly. The kind of man who finds reasons to stand too close while he talks. Who offers to carry things you did not ask for help with. I knew what he was doing. I had seen that look before, so I kept my answers short, kept my hands busy. Never gave him anything he could mistake for invitation. But he did not stop. One evening, about 4 days after I arrived, I was walking through the boarding house hallway. Late. Most folks were already asleep. I passed the front desk and saw something that made me stop. An envelope, sitting on the counter. Fresh. The wax seal was still soft, not quite set. Red wax, with a mark pressed into it, like a coat of arms or something official. It did not belong there. That desk held rent receipts and laundry lists, not sealed documents that looked like they came from a lawyer's office. I did not touch it. I did not even slow down. But I looked, just for a second. And that is when I saw her. Vivian Crow, standing at the end of the hallway, not speaking, just watching. Her eyes were on me. Her smile was small, almost kind. Almost, but it did not reach her face. She saw me see the envelope, and something in her expression changed. Just for a second, like a door closing. I walked to my room and I did not look back. The next day, Ezra cornered me by the stable again. His voice was different this time, low, urgent, like he was the one at risk. He said something about being careful, about keeping my nose out of other people's business, about how some things in this town were better left alone. I stepped back from him. My heel hit a loose board. The board shifted, and underneath it, just for a second, I saw more envelopes, tucked under the hay, all of them marked the same way. Red wax, that same seal. I did not touch them. I did not ask. I just walked away steady, like my heart was not pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. That night I found Martha Phelps outside the wash line. It was dark. She was standing alone, staring at the ground like she wanted it to open up and swallow her whole. She did not speak, but her eyes spoke for her. They begged me, leave now, before this town takes something else from you. I should have listened. By the end of the week, everything had changed. Women stopped meeting my eyes. Conversations cut short the moment I entered a room. The work dried up. The restaurant owner said he did not need help anymore. Would not look at me when he said it. Then came the morning. I woke up to pounding on my door. 3 women I had never spoken to. They said I was coming with them. They said the town had decided. I asked what I had done. They said everybody knew. They said I had been seen with Ezra. They said a decent woman did not put herself in that position. They said I was a danger to their homes and their marriages and their way of life. I told them it was not true. I told them I had never touched that man, never wanted to, never gave him any reason to think I did. They did not care. They dragged me out of that boarding house before the sun was fully up. They took me to the edge of town. They tied me down in the dirt and left me there. And the whole time, I kept thinking about those envelopes, about that red wax seal, about Vivian Crow standing at the end of that hallway with that cold little smile. They were not punishing me for what I did with Ezra. They were punishing me for what I saw. Lily finished speaking. The cabin was quiet except for the soft crackle of the fire in the stove. Caleb sat back in his chair. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were sharp. This seal, would you recognize it if you saw it again? I think so. Yes. And the papers under the stable floor. Did anyone else know about them? Ezra knew I saw them. The way he looked at me afterward, like I had walked into a room I was not supposed to be in. Caleb nodded slowly. The pieces were starting to fit together. Land deals, sealed documents, secret meetings, and a woman powerful enough to turn a whole town against an innocent girl just to keep her quiet. One more question. Lily waited. When you were tied out there, did you see anyone drop a handkerchief? White, with a letter stitched in the corner. Lily thought for a moment. There was a lot of commotion when you cut me loose. People shouting, moving. But yes, I think I saw something white fall. One of the older women. She was standing close. Did you see which woman? No, I was not looking at their hands. I was looking at their faces. Caleb understood. When people showed you who they really were, you did not forget their eyes. He stood up and put his hat back on. You rest now. Mrs. Hale will keep you safe. I have some questions that need asking, and some people who are going to have to start telling the truth. Lily grabbed his sleeve before he could turn away. Why are you doing this? You do not know me. You do not owe me anything. Caleb was quiet for a moment. I have seen this before, a long time ago, a different town, a different woman. I did not speak up then. I told myself it was not my business, that someone else would handle it. His voice went rough. No one did. And that woman paid for my silence with her life. He looked at Lily straight on. I am not making that mistake again. Night had fully fallen by the time Caleb rode back into Dodge City. The town looked different in the dark, quieter, more honest somehow, like the shadows stripped away the pretending. Lamps burned in a few windows, but most folks had already closed their doors, pulled their curtains, chosen the comfort of not knowing over the burden of truth. Caleb did not blame them. Fear was a powerful thing. It made cowards of good people and monsters of ordinary ones. But fear was also a choice, and choices had consequences. He tied his horse outside the saloon and stood in the street for a long moment, thinking, planning. The stranger from the boarding house had mentioned papers. Bad paper following the rail line. That meant money. That meant land. That meant someone in Dodge City was running a scheme big enough to attract attention from people who followed such things. Vivian Crow. Her name kept circling back. She had the power. She had the respectability. She had the cold-eyed willingness to destroy anyone who threatened what she had built. But she was not working alone. A scheme like this required help. It required men who could move documents and money. It required women who would spread rumors and enforce silence. It required a whole system of people who had decided their comfort was worth more than their conscience. And somewhere in that system was a weak link. Someone who knew enough to matter, but who was scared enough to talk. Martha Phelps, the wife of Ezra, the woman who had tried to warn Lily without words, the woman who flinched when Vivian touched her shoulder. Martha was the key. Caleb was sure of it. The next morning, Caleb found Martha at the general store. She was alone, sorting through bolts of fabric, her movements mechanical and distracted. Her face was pale. Dark circles under her eyes suggested she had not slept any better than he had. She saw him enter and went still, like a rabbit that had just spotted a hawk. Mrs. Phelps. He kept his voice low, gentle. I am not here to cause you trouble. I just want to talk. She glanced toward the door, then toward the back of the store. calculating her options, finding none. "I cannot help you." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I do not know anything." Caleb stepped closer, not threatening, just present. "I think you know more than you want to admit, and I think it has been eating at you for a long time." Martha's hands trembled against the fabric. "You do not understand. You do not know what she is capable of." "Vivian Crow?" Martha flinched at the name. That was answer enough. "I know exactly what she is capable of. I saw what she did to Lily Mercer. I saw a young woman tied out in the sun like livestock because she saw something she should not have seen." He paused. "And I think you have seen things too, things that keep you up at night, things that make you afraid to look at your own reflection." Martha's composure cracked. Tears welled in her eyes. "It was not supposed to happen like this. We were just supposed to stay quiet, keep our heads down, let her handle everything. She said it would be better for everyone. She said the money would help the whole town. What money? What is she doing?" Martha shook her head. The fear was too strong. The words would not come. Caleb tried again. "That girl did nothing wrong. She came here looking for a fresh start, and your town destroyed her for it, tied her out in the dirt and left her there. All because she stumbled onto something she did not understand." He leaned in. "Is that the kind of place you want to live? Is that the kind of woman you want to be?" "Stop!" Martha's voice broke. "Please, just stop." She looked around the empty store one more time. Then she spoke fast, the words tumbling out like water through a broken dam. "The papers, the land deeds, they are not real, at least not most of them. Vivian has been altering documents for years, changing names, moving property lines, taking land from people who do not even know they have lost it." She wiped her eyes. "My husband is part of it. Ezra moves the papers, hides them, delivers them to the men who buy and sell. I did not know at first. By the time I figured it out, it was too late. We were already in too deep." "And the sheriff?" Martha nodded. "He looks the other way. Vivian has something on him. I do not know what. But he will not cross her. Nobody will, except you." Martha laughed bitterly. "I am not crossing her. I am just so tired of being afraid." The information was more than Caleb had expected, but it was still not enough. He needed proof, something solid, something that could not be explained away or dismissed as gossip. That evening he found the stranger again, the man with the clean coat and the patient eyes. They met at the edge of town where the road turned toward the Santa Fe Trail. The stranger introduced himself properly this time. Deputy Marshal William Crane. He had been following a trail of fraudulent land deals for the better part of a year. The trail kept leading back to Dodge City, to sealed documents with a particular red wax mark, to land that changed hands faster than it should have, to people who lost everything without ever knowing why. "You are close to something," Crane said. "But close is not the same as finished. We need evidence, real evidence, documents, witnesses, something a judge cannot ignore. I have a witness, a woman named Martha Phelps. She knows enough to put this whole thing together." "Is she willing to testify?" Caleb thought about the fear in Martha's eyes, the way she had looked around the store like someone might be listening. "She is willing to talk. Whether she is willing to stand up in public is another question. Then we need to find those papers, the originals, the ones with the altered seals. If we can show a judge what Vivian has been doing, the testimony becomes secondary." Caleb nodded. "I think I know where they might be. The stable where Ezra works. Lily saw papers hidden under the floorboards, and there was talk of a wagon meeting near the trail. Late night. Secret." Crane's eyes sharpened. "Then that is where we start." The plan was simple. Wait for Vivian to make her next move. Follow the papers, catch them in the act. But plans had a way of falling apart in places like Dodge City, and Vivian Crow had not survived this long by being careless. Word spread fast in small towns. By the next afternoon, everyone knew that Caleb Hart was asking questions, that he had been seen talking to Martha Phelps, that he had ridden out to visit Lily Mercer at Mrs. Hale's place. Vivian responded the only way she knew how. She called a meeting. The church bell rang twice, then twice again. The signal for a gathering, not a church service, not a social event, a reckoning. People filed into the church as the sun went down, filling the benches, whispering among themselves. Caleb walked in last and took a place near the back, arms loose, eyes steady. Vivian stood at the front, hands folded, head bowed just enough to look humble. When she spoke, her voice carried without effort. Friends, neighbors, thank you for coming on such short notice. She paused for effect. I know there has been talk lately. Questions, accusations. I know some of you have been confused about what happened to that young woman who came to our town. Her expression softened. Like a mother explaining something to a child, I want you to know that everything we did was for the protection of our families, our homes, our way of life. We are a community, and communities must sometimes make difficult choices. She looked around the room. That young woman was a threat, not because of who she was, but because of what she represented. Temptation, disorder, the kind of chaos that destroys everything we have worked so hard to build. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. But now there are those who would question our judgment. Who would turn this town against itself? Who would make us doubt what we know to be true? Her eyes found Caleb in the back of the room. I say we cannot let that happen. The church fell silent as Vivian's words hung in the air. Her eyes stayed locked on Caleb like she was daring him to speak, daring him to give her exactly the excuse she needed to turn the whole room against him. Caleb did not look away. He did not fidget. He just waited. Sometimes silence was louder than any words. The sheriff cleared his throat from his seat near the front. He shifted uncomfortably, looking everywhere except at Caleb or Vivian. Like a man caught between two fires and hoping both would burn themselves out before they reached him. A woman in the third row spoke up. Her voice was thin and uncertain. What exactly did that girl do? I heard stories, but nobody seems to know for certain. Vivian's smile did not waver. She was seen pursuing a married man, making advances, putting herself in situations that no decent woman would choose. Several of our most respected citizens witnessed her behavior firsthand. Who? The question came from somewhere in the middle of the room. An older man with weathered hands and honest eyes. Who saw her? Give us names. Vivian hesitated, just for a second. But Caleb saw it. The smallest crack in her perfect composure. I do not think it is appropriate to put our witnesses in an uncomfortable position. They spoke up to protect this community, not to be interrogated. So nobody actually saw anything. Caleb's voice cut through the murmurs. He had not moved from his spot near the back, but his words carried like he was standing at the front. Nobody can name a single moment when that woman did anything wrong. Nobody has any proof except rumors and whispers. He stepped forward. One step, then another. The crowd parted slightly, making room without meaning to. I have talked to people in this town. I have asked questions. And do you know what I found? He stopped in the center aisle. Not one person saw Lily Mercer do anything improper. Not one. All anybody knows is what they were told, what they heard from somebody who heard from somebody else. His eyes swept the room. That is not justice. That is gossip dressed up in righteousness. Vivian's voice sharpened. Mr. Hart, your sympathy for fallen women is touching, but perhaps your own past makes you blind to certain truths. She let the words land. Let people wonder what she meant. I understand you carry guilt. We all know there are things in your history you would rather forget. Perhaps that guilt is what makes you so eager to defend someone who does not deserve defending. Caleb felt the old wound open, the memory he had carried for years, the woman he had not helped, the silence that still haunted him, but he did not let it show. My past is my business. This is not about me. This is about a woman who was dragged from her bed, tied out in the sun, left there to suffer. All because she saw something she was not supposed to see. The room stirred. People looked at each other, some confused, some curious, some afraid. Saw something? The question came from the older man again. What do you mean, saw something? Caleb was about to answer when the church door opened behind him. Every head turned. Deputy Marshal William Crane stepped inside. He walked slowly, deliberately, like a man who knew exactly what he was walking into. He stopped beside Caleb and faced the crowd. Good evening, folks. I apologize for the interruption, but I think this gathering just became a lot more interesting. Vivian's composure flickered again. This time it was more than a crack. It was recognition. She knew who Crane was, or at least she knew what he represented. And who might you be? Her voice stayed smooth, but her hands had tightened against her skirt. Deputy Marshal William Crane, United States Marshals Service. I have been following a trail of fraudulent land documents for the better part of a year. That trail keeps leading back to this town. He let that sink in. More specifically, it keeps leading back to documents marked with a particular red wax seal, the kind of seal that does not belong on legitimate papers. Murmurs erupted. People turned to look at each other, then at Vivian, then back at Crane. I do not know what you are implying, Vivian said, but I assure you I have nothing to do with whatever business brings you here. Crane nodded slowly. Maybe not. But I think the folks in this room deserve to know what I found. And I think they deserve to ask themselves some hard questions about what has been happening in their town. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper. This is a deed, property about 10 miles east of here. The original owner died 2 years ago. According to this document, the land was sold to a company based in Kansas City 6 months after his death. He unfolded the paper and held it up. Problem is, the original owner had a daughter. She never sold anything, she never signed anything, and she certainly never agreed to give up her inheritance. The red wax seal was visible even from the back of the room. Someone altered this document, changed the names, forged the signatures, took land that did not belong to them. His eyes moved to Vivian. And whoever did it used a seal just like the ones that have been showing up all over this territory. The room exploded into noise, questions, accusations, denials. People stood up from their seats. Voices overlapped and collided. Through it all, Vivian stayed still. Her face had gone pale, but her chin remained high. This is absurd. I am a respected member of this community. I have given more to this town than anyone in this room, and now I am supposed to stand here and be accused by strangers? She turned to the crowd. Are we really going to let outsiders come in here and tell us who we are? Are we going to let them destroy everything we have built? Some people nodded. Others looked uncertain. Caleb stepped forward again. Nobody is trying to destroy anything. We are trying to find the truth. And the truth is that a young woman was tortured because she got too close to something somebody wanted hidden. He pulled the white handkerchief from his pocket. The one with the stitched letter V. I found this where Lily was tied. It fell from one of the women who was there. One of the women who helped do this to her. He held it up. Whose handkerchief is this? Silence. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then a voice came from the middle rows. Quiet, but clear. It is mine. Martha Phelps stood up. Her face was white. Her hands were shaking. But she stood up anyway. The crowd turned to stare at her. Vivian's eyes went wide with something that looked almost like betrayal. Martha. Vivian's voice was low. Warning. Sit down. No. Martha's voice trembled, but she did not sit. I am done sitting down. I am done being quiet. I am done pretending that what we did was right. She looked around the room at all the familiar faces. That girl did not do anything wrong. Ezra was the one pursuing her. She told him no, over and over again. And when she saw things she should not have seen, Vivian decided she had to be punished. She took a shaky breath. We all knew it was wrong, every single one of us. But we were too scared to say anything. too scared of what Vivian would do, too scared of losing what little we had. Her voice broke. Well, I am more scared of becoming the kind of person who ties a woman out in the sun and calls it justice. She sat back down, heavy, exhausted, like standing up had cost her everything she had. The room was completely silent. Caleb watched faces change, doubt creeping in, certainty crumbling, the first cracks in a wall that had seemed unbreakable. Crane spoke into the silence. There will be an investigation. We will examine documents, interview witnesses, follow the evidence wherever it leads. He looked at Vivian. I would suggest you think carefully about your next steps, ma'am. Cooperation tends to go easier than resistance. Vivian said nothing. Her eyes had gone cold and calculating, the face of a woman already planning her next move. The meeting broke up slowly. People drifted out in ones and twos. Nobody knew what to say. Nobody knew what came next. But something had changed. The lie had been spoken out loud. And once spoken, it could not be unheard. The night after the church meeting, Dodge City held its breath. Windows that usually glowed late stayed dark. Doors that usually hung open were bolted shut. The whole town felt like a powder keg waiting for a spark. Caleb could not sleep. He sat on the porch of the boarding house where he had taken a room, watching the street, listening, waiting. Something was coming. He could feel it in his bones. Around midnight, he saw movement near the edge of town. A wagon, 2 horses pulling hard. No lantern, no announcement. Just shadows sliding through shadows. He was on his horse before he had time to think about it. The wagon headed east on the Santa Fe Trail, away from town, away from witnesses. Caleb followed at a distance, keeping to the brush, letting the darkness cover him. He knew these roads, knew the cutoffs and the hiding places, knew where a person might go if they wanted to move something without being seen. The wagon turned at the Cimarron cutoff, a low spot where the ground flattened out and the trail split 3 ways. It was the kind of place men used when they did not want to be followed. Caleb reined in behind a stand of cottonwood trees and dismounted. He crept forward on foot, staying low, staying silent. The wagon had stopped. 2 men climbed down and started unloading crates. Heavy crates, the kind that made noise when you set them down wrong. Then a 3rd figure emerged from the darkness, Vivian Crow. She wore a dark shawl and no smile at all. She did not touch the crates. She did not lift a finger. She just spoke quietly, and the men moved. That told Caleb everything he needed to know about who was really in charge. He watched, waited, counted heads. 2 men with the wagon, Vivian, and a 4th figure hanging back near the horses. Hard to see, hard to identify. Then Deputy Marshal Crane appeared beside him, silent as a ghost. Caleb nearly jumped out of his skin. Easy, Crane whispered. I have been following them since they left the stable. What is in the crates? Papers, documents, everything they do not want found. My guess is they are moving it somewhere safer, somewhere out of reach. Caleb nodded. We cannot let that wagon leave. Crane pulled his pistol from its holster. Then we do not let it leave. They moved together through the darkness. Caleb went left, Crane went right, circling, closing in. The men at the wagon were nervous, jumping at sounds, glancing over their shoulders. They knew what they were doing was wrong. That kind of knowing made people sloppy. Crane stepped out of the shadows first. His voice carried clear and calm across the clearing. United States Marshal, nobody moves. For half a second, everything froze. Then chaos. One of the men made a break for the trees. Another went for a rifle propped against the wagon wheel. The 4th figure near the horses shouted and started pulling at the reins. Caleb moved without thinking. He hit the man with the rifle before the gun cleared the wagon. Shoulder first, hard. They went down in a tangle of limbs and dust. A fist caught Caleb in the ribs. Sharp, painful. He grunted and kept fighting. Twisted, pinned the man's arm, drove his elbow into the man's jaw. The man went limp. Across the clearing, Crane fired a shot straight up into the sky. The crack split the night air like thunder. Horses screamed, the wagon lurched, everyone stopped. Hands went up. Someone cursed under his breath. The man who had run for the trees stood frozen at the edge of the clearing, arms raised, face pale in the starlight. Vivian had not moved. She stood exactly where she had been standing before, eyes cold, calculating, looking for a way out. There was none. Caleb walked toward her, slow, steady. "It is over." She laughed once, short and bitter. "You think this changes anything? You think one night stops what I have built? I have been running this town for 15 years. I have friends in places you cannot imagine. People who owe me, people who need me." She tilted her chin up. "This is nothing, a setback. By next week, everyone will remember who keeps this town running, who puts food on their tables, who decides what is right and what is wrong." Caleb shook his head. "That is not how this works anymore." He turned to Crane. "What is in the crates?" Crane was already prying one open. He pulled out handfuls of papers. "Documents, letters, ledgers, land deeds," he said. "Dozens of them. Banknotes, promissory agreements. And look at these seals." He held up a document so Caleb could see. Same red wax, same mark. "This is everything we need." One of the captured men started talking before anyone even asked. Words spilling out fast and desperate. Names, dates, meeting places, who paid whom and when and how much. Fear had a way of loosening tongues. By the time dawn started creeping into the sky, they had enough testimony to fill a courtroom. Enough evidence to explain everything that had happened. Enough proof to show exactly how Vivian Crow had spent 15 years slowly taking control of everything and everyone in Dodge City. The wagon rolled back toward town with the crates loaded and the prisoners tied. Caleb rode alongside. Crane brought up the rear. Vivian sat in the back of the wagon with her hands bound. She did not speak, did not plead, did not threaten. She just stared straight ahead with eyes like winter ice. Caleb knew that look. It was the look of someone who was already planning their next move, their next scheme, their next way out. But this time, there was no way out. The evidence was too strong. The witnesses were too many. The truth had finally caught up with her. They reached Dodge City as the sun cleared the horizon. People were already gathering. Word had spread faster than any horse could carry it. The wagon stopped in front of the church, the same spot where Caleb had laid Lily down 2 days before. The crates were unloaded. Documents spread across a table in the morning light. Crane stood beside them and explained what they had found, what it meant, what was going to happen next. Vivian stood silent through all of it, watched her empire crumble document by document. Then Martha Phelps pushed through the crowd. She was carrying something in her arms, a leather-bound ledger with worn edges and ink-stained pages. "This is everything," she said, "every transaction, every bribe, every secret meeting. Vivian made me keep records. She said it was insurance in case anyone ever turned on her." She held out the ledger with shaking hands. "I should have done this years ago. I should have been braver. But I was so scared of what she would do." Her voice cracked. Lily was not the first person Vivian hurt. She was just the first one who survived long enough for someone to notice. The crowd went absolutely still. Caleb took the ledger gently from Martha's hands. He looked at her face and saw something he had not expected. Relief. Pure, overwhelming relief. Like she had been carrying a weight for years and had finally set it down. The next few days moved slow and heavy, like a river after a storm. The floodwaters had passed, but the damage was everywhere. And now came the harder work, the rebuilding. Vivian Crow was taken into custody by Deputy Marshal Crane. She would face federal charges for land fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. The men who had worked with her were rounded up one by one, Ezra Phelps among them. Martha stood on the porch of her home and watched them lead her husband away. She did not cry. She did not call out. She just watched with that same expression of exhausted relief. The sheriff turned in his badge the day after the arrest. He said it was for his health. Nobody believed him, but nobody argued either. Some truths did not need to be spoken out loud. The town council met to discuss what came next. New leadership, new rules, a way forward that did not involve looking the other way. It was not easy. It was never going to be easy. 15 years of corruption did not wash away overnight. But for the first time in a long time, people were talking honestly, admitting what they had allowed, asking themselves hard questions about who they wanted to be. Lily came back to town on the third day. She rode in on Mrs. Hale's wagon, wrapped in a clean shawl, her head held high. The bruises on her wrists had started to fade. The bruises on her spirit would take longer. People watched her arrive. Some looked away, ashamed. Others nodded or tipped their hats. Small gestures. But gestures mattered. Caleb met the wagon at the edge of town. He walked alongside it as it rolled down the main street, not speaking, just present. Lily looked at the faces watching her pass, memorizing them again. But this time, the weight of their eyes felt different. Not judgment, not cruelty, something closer to apology. The formal reckoning came a week later, a public hearing in the church. Everyone was invited. Everyone was expected. Deputy Marshal Crane presented the evidence. The altered land deeds, the forged signatures, the ledger Martha had kept, the testimony of men who had been part of the scheme. It was worse than most people had imagined. Vivian had been stealing land for years, changing ownership records, taking property from families who never knew they had lost it. She had built her respectability on theft and silence and fear. When the presentation was over, Crane asked if anyone had anything to say. Silence filled the church. Then one woman stood up. Mrs. Patterson, who ran the bakery. She was maybe 60 years old, silver-haired, soft-spoken. I knew. Her voice was quiet but clear. Not everything. But I knew something was wrong. The way Vivian talked, the way people were afraid of her, the way things always seemed to work out in her favor. She looked around the room. I did not say anything because I did not want trouble. I told myself it was not my business, that someone else would handle it. She sat back down. I was wrong. Another person stood, then another. One by one, people confessed their silence, their complicity, their choice to look away. It was not comfortable, it was not pleasant, but it was honest, and honest was the only way forward. When the hearing ended, Caleb found Lily outside the church. She was sitting on the steps, watching the sunset paint the sky orange and purple. He sat down beside her. Not too close, just close enough. How are you holding up? She thought about the question before answering. Better than I expected. Worse than I hoped. She looked at her hands. The bandages were gone now. The rope burns had faded to thin pink lines. I keep thinking about what would have happened if you had not come along. If you had ridden past and minded your own business like everyone else. I would not have done that. I know, but most people would have. She met his eyes. Why are you different? Caleb was quiet for a long moment. I told you before, something happened. A long time ago, a different town. A different woman. His voice went rough. Her name was Sarah. She was accused of something she did not do. The town turned on her just like they turned on you. I was young, scared. I told myself it was not my fight. He looked away. They hanged her on a Tuesday morning. I stood in the crowd and watched it happen, did not say a word, did not lift a finger. The pain in his voice was old but still sharp. I have carried that silence for 30 years. Every day, every night. The weight of it never goes away. He looked back at Lily. When I saw you out there in the dirt, I did not see a stranger. I saw Sarah. I saw every person who ever needed help and did not get it because good people stayed quiet. His jaw tightened. I could not stay quiet again. Lily did not say anything for a while. She just sat with his words. Let them settle. Then she reached out and took his hand. Her grip was gentle but certain. Thank you. 2 words. Simple and honest. Caleb felt something loosen in his chest, something that had been knotted tight for decades. He squeezed her hand back. The days that followed were full of work. Real work. The kind that left calluses on your hands and satisfaction in your heart. Caleb helped rebuild fences on farms that had been neglected. He organized meetings where people could ask questions and voice concerns. He stood beside the new sheriff and made sure justice was done fair and square. Lily threw herself into helping too. She worked with Mrs. Hale, learning how to tend wounds and comfort the sick. She visited families who had lost land to Vivian's schemes and helped them file claims to get it back. She was not the same woman who had arrived in Dodge City a month before. That woman had been hopeful, but naive. Full of dreams, but short on experience. This woman was stronger, harder in some ways, but also more compassionate. She had learned what it meant to suffer unjustly, and she was determined to make sure others did not have to learn the same lesson. Martha Phelps filed for divorce. It was scandalous by the standards of the time, but nobody dared criticize her. She had risked everything to tell the truth. She had earned the right to start over. She moved into a small house on the edge of town and took up dressmaking. Turned out she was good at it, really good. Within a few months, women were traveling from miles away to buy her dresses. Sometimes she and Lily would sit together in the evening and talk about what had happened, about what came next, about the strange paths that had brought them both to this place. They had been on opposite sides once. Now they were something like friends. That was how healing worked. Slow, unexpected, full of surprises. Summer deepened over Dodge City. The sun stayed high longer, the grass turned golden, the air smelled of heat and dust and possibility. Caleb found himself looking forward to each day in a way he had not felt in years. There was purpose in his step, meaning in his work. And there was Lily. She had taken to visiting his ranch. At first it was practical. She needed to learn how things worked out here, how to mend fence, how to spot a storm before it broke, how to sit still and let the land do the talking. Caleb taught her all of it, patient and thorough. But somewhere along the way, the lessons became something else. Excuses to spend time together. Reasons to share meals and stories and long evenings watching the sky change colors. They did not rush anything. They did not need to. Time moved differently on the prairie. Slower, more deliberate. One evening they sat on the porch of Caleb's cabin watching the sun go down. The silence between them was comfortable. The kind of silence that only comes when two people understand each other without words. Can I ask you something? Lily's voice broke the quiet. Anything. Why did you never marry? Caleb considered the question. I came close once, long time ago, before Sarah, before everything changed. He paused. Her name was Catherine. She was smart, beautiful, kind. Everything a man could want. What happened? I let fear get in the way. I kept finding reasons to wait, told myself I was not ready, that there would be time later. His voice went quiet. There was not. She got sick. Fever took her in 3 days. I never even told her how I felt. He looked at Lily. After that, I closed myself off. Told myself it was better to be alone. That caring about someone only led to pain. And now I wonder if I was wrong. Lily did not respond right away. She just looked at him. Really looked, seeing the man behind the walls he had built. You were not wrong to protect yourself. Her voice was soft. But you were wrong to think you could go through life without connection, without love. We are not meant to be alone, Caleb, even when it hurts, maybe especially when it hurts. She reached out and touched his hand. I have spent the last month learning what it means to be seen, to be believed, to have someone stand up for me when everyone else looked away. She squeezed his fingers. You gave me that. You gave me my life back. I did not give you anything. You survived on your own. I just helped clear the path. Lily shook her head. You did more than that. You showed me that good people still exist, that courage is not dead, that one person standing up can change everything. She moved closer. I do not know what comes next. I do not know where I am supposed to be or what I am supposed to do, but I know one thing. What is that? I know I want to find out, and I know I want you beside me while I figure it out. Caleb felt something shift inside him, something old and frozen starting to thaw. He had spent 30 years punishing himself for a mistake he made as a young man. 30 years believing he did not deserve happiness. 30 years keeping the world at arm's length. But Lily was right. He had not been meant for solitude. He had been meant for this, for connection, for love. Even if it scared him, even if it meant risking pain again. Some things were worth the risk. He lifted her hand and pressed it to his chest. Let her feel his heart beating. I am not a young man anymore. I have more years behind me than ahead. Age is just a number. I have made mistakes, done things I am not proud of. So have I. So has everyone. He smiled. Just a little. You are stubborn, you know that? I learned from the best. She leaned in and kissed him, soft and certain, like a promise. When she pulled back, her eyes were shining. So, what do we do now? Caleb looked at the sunset, at the land stretching out before them, at the woman beside him who had walked through fire and come out stronger. We live, we work, we build something worth having. He squeezed her hand, and we do it together. The weeks that followed were the happiest Caleb had known in decades. He and Lily fell into a rhythm, working side by side during the day, sharing meals in the evening, talking about everything and nothing as the stars came out. They did not make grand declarations. They did not need to. Love showed itself in small ways. A shared glance, a touch on the shoulder, the way they finished each other's thoughts. The town noticed. Of course it did. Gossip spread in Dodge City like water through a cracked dam. But this time the talk was different. Kinder. People smiled when they saw Caleb and Lily together. They nodded approvingly. They whispered not about scandal, but about hope. Maybe they were making up for what had happened before. Maybe they were just happy to see something good come out of so much pain. Either way, it felt like a blessing. One morning, Martha Phelps came by the ranch with a package wrapped in brown paper. I made this for you. She handed it to Lily. A wedding dress. Lily's eyes went wide. But we have not even... I know. You will, though. Anyone with eyes can see it. Martha smiled. Consider it a thank you for giving me the courage to speak up when it mattered. Lily unwrapped the package carefully. Inside was the most beautiful dress she had ever seen. White silk with delicate lace trim. Simple, but elegant. Perfect. She hugged Martha tight. Thank you. Just promise me one thing. What? Promise me you will be happy. Really, truly happy. You have earned it. Lily looked at Caleb, who was watching from the porch with a smile on his face. I promise. Autumn came to Kansas like a slow exhale. The heat broke. The leaves turned gold and red. The air smelled of wood smoke and harvest. Vivian Crow stood trial in a federal courthouse 200 miles from Dodge City. The evidence was overwhelming. The testimony was damning. She was found guilty on 12 counts of fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. The judge sentenced her to 15 years in federal prison. Enough time that she would never see Dodge City again. Some people said justice had been served. Others said it was not enough. But everyone agreed on one thing. The reign of Vivian Crow was over. The families who had lost land began getting it back. Legal claims were filed. Property records were corrected. One by one, the damage was undone. It took time. These things always did. But progress was made, and progress was enough. The sheriff's office was filled by a new man, a veteran from the cavalry who had no debts and no secrets. He was honest and fair and completely immune to intimidation. Under his watch, Dodge City became something it had not been in a long time. A place where the law meant something, where justice was more than just a word. People started trusting each other again, started leaving their doors unlocked, started believing that tomorrow could be better than yesterday. It was not perfect. No town ever was, but it was healing. And healing was what mattered. Mrs. Hale passed away peacefully in her sleep that October. She was 83 years old and had spent her entire life helping others. The funeral was the biggest Dodge City had ever seen. People came from miles around to pay their respects. They spoke of her kindness, her wisdom, her willingness to help anyone who needed it. Lily cried that day, really cried, for the woman who had taken her in when she had nowhere else to go. For the mentor who had taught her that strength and compassion were not opposites. But even through the tears, she felt gratitude. Gratitude for having known such a remarkable woman. Gratitude for the time they had shared. Mrs. Hale had left her cabin to Lily in her will, along with a note. Use this place to help others the way I helped you. That is all I ask. Lily promised she would. Winter came early that year. The first snow fell in late November, blanketing the prairie in white. Caleb proposed on a quiet evening when the fire crackled and the wind howled outside. He did not have a ring. He did not have fancy words. He just took her hand and asked if she would do him the honor of becoming his wife. Lily said yes before he finished the sentence. They were married in the spring in the same church where the town had once gathered to condemn her. The same church where the truth had finally come out. It felt right, like they were rewriting history, claiming the space that had once been used against her and turning it into something beautiful. Martha made the dress just as she had promised. It fit perfectly. The whole town came to watch, even people who had been part of the mob that tied Lily out in the sun. They stood in the pews with shame in their eyes and hope in their hearts. Forgiveness was a process. It did not happen all at once, but it started somewhere, and this was as good a place as any. The years that followed were kind to Caleb and Lily Hart. They built a life together on the ranch, raised horses, grew crops, took in orphaned children who needed a home and a family. Lily turned Mrs. Hale's cabin into a healing house, a place where the sick could come and be tended, where the wounded could rest and recover. She learned everything Mrs. Hale had known and added her own wisdom to it. People came from all over the territory seeking her help. She turned no one away. Caleb worked the land with the same steady patience he brought to everything. He taught their children how to ride, how to work, how to stand up for what was right even when it was hard. He never forgot Sarah. Never stopped carrying that old guilt. But it no longer crushed him. It had become part of his story, part of what made him who he was. And who he was, finally, was a happy man. Martha remarried eventually, a quiet farmer from the next county who saw past her history and loved her for who she was. They had 3 children together. All of them grew up knowing the story of how their mother had stood up when it mattered most. The new sheriff served for 20 years before retiring with honors. Under his leadership, Dodge City became known as a fair place. A good place. The kind of town where people wanted to raise their families. The corruption never came back. Not because there were no bad people, but because good people had learned to speak up, to watch for warning signs, to choose courage over comfort. That was the real change. Not in the laws or the leaders, in the people themselves. Caleb passed away on a warm June morning when he was 78 years old. He went peacefully, with Lily's hand in his and a smile on his face. The funeral was quiet, just family and close friends, the way he would have wanted it. Lily stood at his grave and spoke the words she had been carrying for decades. Thank you for seeing me when nobody else did, for standing up when nobody else would, for teaching me that one person can make a difference. She touched the headstone. I will love you forever. And she did. She lived another 12 years, helping, healing, teaching others what Caleb had taught her. When people asked about her life, she always told them the same thing. I was broken once, tied out in the sun and left to suffer. I thought my story was over. She would smile then, that knowing smile that held decades of wisdom. But it was just beginning, because one man chose to see the truth. One man chose to cut the ropes. One man reminded me that courage is not loud. It is steady. It is showing up. It is refusing to look away. Her eyes would go distant. That is what I hope you remember from my story. Not the cruelty, not the pain, but the moment someone chose to be brave. She would take your hand, because you can make that choice too, today, right now. The next time you see someone suffering, the next time silence would be easier than speaking up. Her grip would tighten. Choose courage. Choose compassion. Choose to be the person someone else is praying for. That is how we change the world, one small choice at a time. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.